Hey guys, we're going to do another one of these retro review reactions. This one is of a two-door Volvo 240 Turbo. I happen to have one of those that I had for about 2 years before I sold it, and I thought it would be kind of cool to see what they thought of it brand new, and I could give you some of my thoughts. Here we go.
Be best described as a high-powered trip into the world of executive playthings. We're talking about the turbocharged Volvo. A car for those who love to drive but maybe don't care to advertise their desires. It comes with a price tag of $13,970.
$13,000 back then wasn't cheap.
A weight of 3,000 pounds and a length of over 16 feet. Certainly neither small nor cheap. Up to now, Volvo has had a solid but stodgy reputation. But is it possible Volvo is making...
I think you're going to see throughout this video that they have an idea of what Volvo is at this time period, and they're not really truly open to something like a performance car from Volvo. And it shows by the way they talk.
A car that's fun to drive. Well, why don't we just find out?
You've probably never heard of a fast Volvo. Well, we hadn't either until this, the Volvo GLT Turbo. That means turbocharged, and it makes the normally brick-like Volvo move more like a sprinter. From the outside, there are only subtle clues to its new speed: blacked-out chrome, a small air dam at the front, special cast wheels.
I will say these wheels, they're known as Virgo turbo wheels is what they called them. They ended up later on a lot of different Volvo projects because the more mundane Volvo 240s at the time had 14-inch wheels, which hard to get tires for once you started to age the car out. Well, these were 15s, so more people tried to buy these up. I actually owned a set of those a couple years ago.
And very expensive Pirelli P6 tires.
They also talk about the fact that there was only blacked out chrome trim, which isn't the truth. The grille on a Volvo 240 was chrome, and the grille on these cars was a waffle pattern, and it was black.
On the inside, it's almost all understated Volvo. From the driver's seat, the view is almost totally unobstructed. And an unusual touch is the electrically operated outside mirrors. We discovered them when a clipboard between the seats jammed their motors into operation. Our car also came equipped with a 4-speed manual gearbox that has no...
This 4-speed manual gearbox with the electronic overdrive was actually co-created with Jaguar. My 240 that I built that I called Turbo had this transmission, and over time when the fluid would break down, the electronic overdrive would stick, so you would be trying to shift from fourth to third and still be in overdrive, which was a real problem. Luckily I learned to just take the screen off of the bottom of the transmission pan, cleaned that out, put it back in with new fluid, and it fixed that problem. But besides that, these were great gearboxes.
An electric overdrive for better highway mileage. The seats are big and firm with adjustable backrest, bottom cushion height, and even lower back lumbar support.
Volvo has always had the best and most comfortable seats of any car sold. I truly believe that. They use orthopedics to make sure that the seats are contoured correctly for the person who's riding in them.
Important for long journeys. The dashboard is mostly black plastic with only the numbers on the dial standing out. There's a full complement of gauges, but a special turbo boost pressure gauge is the only item that tells you that...
Yeah, most people added their own special gauges in this gauge pod that you see here. My car Turbo, I added a bunch of special gauges, including a turbo boost gauge, an air-fuel ratio gauge, a water temp gauge, and an oil pressure gauge, along with a voltmeter. These cars did not come with the water temperature gauge.
That this Volvo is not ordinary. All controls were easily accessible, although placement and operation of some, especially the heating and air conditioning switches, will take some getting used to. And the radio is also buried at the bottom of the dash behind the gear shift.
You know, it is true that probably putting the radio all the way down there was a problem, but once you got used to it and you got used to your stereo that you put in there, it really wasn't a problem. I wanted to say that these two-door Volvos are really rare now because They made the Volvo 240 from 1974 to 1993, but they stopped selling the two-door in 1985, so they're really hard to come by.
From a standing start, the Volvo is quick. It's hard to resist the temptation to squeal the tires as the turbo comes into play. But here comes the first disappointment. As you move your way up the gears, the turbo only makes the acceleration seem adequate. Third and fourth gear just didn't seem to suit the rest of the system. But as one driver put it, without the turbo, you might think you were moving backwards. And then that's what the turbo is really for. It's there to make the 2.1-liter fuel injection engine feel much more like it's got a big heart. And the GLT does. As our test team,
I think that they have a preconceived notion that Volvos should be slow or that Volvos aren't fun to drive. And I think that comes into play quite often in this review.
soon found out. True to my first impressions, the best that the GLT Turbo would do in our passing acceleration test was a flat 5 seconds. A lot of much less impressive cars can make the 40 to 55 sprint in that time. Disappointment number 2. The Volvo feels big and solid and yearns to be tossed around. But just try it and you might be in for a surprise. Entering our slalom course at 35, most of the drivers had to ease off to keep the long and heavy rear end from coming unglued from the pavement. Water on our test track may have affected the holding power of the Pirelli tires. They
said the water might have caused problems with the Pirelli tires. Correct, they're summer tires. They're made to be sticky. They're not made to be used in all weather conditions. Surprise.
more attuned to dry pavement. What we found was that perhaps this car wants to be much more of a sports car than it was ever designed for. But then, it is a Volvo.
Okay, did you just hear that? But then, it is a Volvo. And you think these people have some kind of preconceived notion. It seems like they're trying really hard not to dislike the car because of the fact that they just have maybe a bad history with them. Because, yeah, Volvos aren't the fastest cars at that time period. They're kind of slow. This one isn't a rocket ship, but I don't think they give it its due.
The turning diameter came to about 36 feet. That's about average for this size of car. Panic stops from 30 yielded a stopping distance of 40 feet. That was an average figure, and there was no fade. From 55, the stopping power of the large brakes and expensive tires paid off for an average of 120 feet. That's a very safe showing for such a heavy car. Only as the test progressed did we notice any slight fade and some tendency to pull to one side.
You know, there have been auto manufacturers that have offered four-wheel disc brakes, but you know, back in the 50s and 60s. Volvo was the first company to offer four-wheel disc brakes standard. They didn't have any drum brakes in the back, and I will say the brakes on a Volvo 240 were very substantial. They were really good brakes, stopped the car, you know, in a real short distance. I never was worried about them. I never even worried about in a panic stop if I would downshift.
But control was always maintained. When you open the hood, you see the heart of the engine clearly marked.
Okay, the way the intercooler piping works on this car is the air comes out into the exhaust. Some of it goes out and some of it turns a wheel, which then pushes more air over a pipe and into the throttle body. Well, this car didn't have an intercooler. An intercooler actually cools down that charged air from the exhaust to give you more horsepower. My car had that. This one doesn't have that. But also, the 2.1 liter engine was upgraded to the 2.3 liter, which Volvo used for the next 20 years. And with the turbocharger, the 2.3 made about 160 to 170. This car was maybe pushing 130, but it was pretty good for a first try.
Turbo. Actually, the turbocharger itself is located on the lower right of the engine at the exhaust manifold. The long hose directs the supercharged airflow into the engine, increasing power and thus acceleration. One caution, turbochargers are expensive devices and they can be expected to be costly to maintain. Otherwise, the engine compartment is clear, with most items easy to get to. With a big square car like this, our standard set.
I don't even need to say anything, really. If you look at that trunk, that trunk was huge. You could put anything in there. I remember one time I was going on a trip, and I was taking my dad's truck to Iowa from Kansas, and I had to pick up a bunch of firewood, but the guy wasn't going to be home before 5 o'clock, and I didn't have the truck yet, so I just took my 240 and I filled up my trunk full of firewood. You know, he's telling you that if it's a box on wheels, it's a box, so it's very roomy.
Set of luggage almost went out of sight. You can also stand grocery bags upright when supermarket shopping. The spare tire is mounted inside the left rear fender in the trunk. Very much out of the way, but very easy to get to.
The only problem with the spare tire being up against the quarter panel was that dirt and salt got trapped behind the rear mud flaps, and when they were trapped behind the rear mud flaps, it caused those areas to rot off. So when you buy a Volvo today, you have to double check those areas right behind the mud flaps, because there can actually be pretty big holes there.
It was easy to remove despite the high rear sill of the trunk, and the jack is first rate, but it does take some stamina to crank up. The tire change by a first-timer came to a very quick 10 minutes. On balance, the Volvo is a strong, heavy car that really needs the turbocharger to improve performance. It doesn't handle as well as we expect.
I think that that's an objective opinion, talking about how it needs the turbo for performance. Up until this date, Volvo was doing very well. Volvo was selling cars very well. Volvo had a lot of people who came back to buy cars from them, and those cars were not fast. People didn't necessarily buy a Volvo to be a sports car. You know, they bought it because they were strong and they were safe and they were reliable. It just so happens that, you know, this was the first foray into performance cars that Volvo had.
Expected, but then we probably got carried away with its low gear acceleration. The EPA rates this car at 18 mpg city and 28 highway. We managed 18 to 24 in our testing, figures that betray the engine size and weight of the car. The Volvo GLT is not a car for everyone. It's a mixed breed of old world design and high technology.
I'll say I personally have nothing but fond memories of my 242, my turbo car. I really enjoyed it. And yes, there were some things I learned, like there were some electrical gremlins. I had a situation where I was coming out of the Walmart in Leavenworth, Kansas, and I was about 10 miles from my house. Now, you know when you don't put your seatbelt on and you have that bing, bing, bing? Well, somehow there was a wire crossed at a junction point. So every time I stepped on the brake pedal, the car went bing, bing, bing. Now you think about it, you don't realize how many times you step on the brake in a period of 10 miles in the city. I wanted to pull my hair out. So I got out a wiring schematic and I found out where those two joined up together, and one of the wires was bare, so I fixed that. You know, I got to learn, I learned about how to do body work, fixing the rust that was on the back of that 242. But, you know, there are some things that were modern on the car, but then there were also some things, that motor had been developed since the 60s. But I have nothing but praise and fond memories of that car. It never broke down, it never left me stranded. Partially due to the fact that I bought it from a guy who was a mechanic for Vern's Imports in Kansas City, which was a Volvo-only antique car restoration. So when I bought it from him, it had been kept up for years and years. And it's funny because, funny story, I was at my first Volvo Club meeting in Kansas City, and one of the people at the meeting said, "Did you just buy Vern's daughter's Volvo?" And I said, "No, I bought a Volvo from a guy over on Parallel Parkway in Kansas City." And they said, "That's Vern's head mechanic. He got Vern's daughter's car that Vern bought her brand new." So it's like Volvo stay in the family, and that's for sure. And I think that's one of the other reasons why I enjoyed the car, because I knew where it came from.
The turbo may be expensive to keep up, but it can make the car a lot of fun. So if you like understatement with a little flash, and you've got the wallet to enjoy it, then the Volvo GLT Turbo just might carry you away.
I think that was a mixed bag. I think on one hand they were kind of hard on the car, but you know, you wonder what in their mind they were comparing the car to, you know, talking about how it didn't want to handle the way they wanted it to, or didn't accelerate the way they wanted it to. Were they comparing it to other Volvos? Were they comparing it to sports cars? Because it's not a sports car. It's a family car, and that turbocharger just helped to give it more oomph, more power. So when they make some of their criticisms, it does make me wonder what in their brain they were comparing it to. Well, I'll say that of all the cars I've owned, the story about how I got the car and the work I learned to do on the car, and the fact that when I finally sold it, there was an older guy in Leavenworth who had 3 Volvo 240s. His kids were in college. They all drove a 240, an old 240. He had his own Volvo 240 sedan, and his daughter drove a 740 Turbo station wagon. So when I was getting ready to sell it, I knew exactly who to come see, and I went and talked to him, and he test drove the car, and within a minute, about 10 minutes, we were at an ATM getting some money. So yeah, I'd say I have nothing but fond memories of this car. There's not one negative thing that I can say. All right, guys, remember, if you have a car that you remember fondly, put it in the comments, and maybe I'll look it up on a Motor Week Retro and we can see what your car was like. All right, talk to you later, guys.